Cullum, who's principal in charge of technical development at Fair & Peers. Fair & Peers is a very well-known and well-respected transportation consulting firm based in Walnut Creek with offices around California and up and down the coast, and soon to be opening an office in D.C., which sounds very exciting. I think of Fair & Peers as the thinking person's transportation consulting firm, beyond doing the typical traffic impact studies and signal timing studies and that sort of stuff. They do a lot of work that's really at the forefront of change in the transportation planning and transportation engineering fields. And I think Ron's talk today is a great example of that. He's going to talk about the shift from mobility to accessibility. Those of you who've been in my classes know that this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. It's something we academics have talked about for a long time now. But the question always has been, to what degree is that change of thinking happening in practice? So I'm very excited to hear Ron's talk about that very topic. You know, what sort of progress are we making towards a change in thinking in transportation planning? So let's welcome Ron. And I will turn this over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, sharing some of my thoughts on the evolution of transportation planning and the shift that Susan mentioned from mobility to accessibility. Along with any kind of evolution, there are definitely bumps, mutations along the road, so I want to cover some of those as well. And to try and make this as relevant as possible, I know we've got a pretty diverse audience here. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a history lesson. I know we're here to talk about transportation, but for me, I think history is going to make this a little bit more relevant. It will help us understand where we're at in the story. So if we're here today to talk about the story of the evolution of transportation planning, I want you to understand, well, where was the beginning, and where are we at, in the middle or towards the front, and where might we be going? At least from my perspective as a practitioner, Susan said, just curious about what we're doing at the practical applications end. And I'm definitely coming to you as a practitioner, so keep that in mind. So I want to start back in colonial America, actually. And this is actually a picture of Wall Street. And you'll notice here that we've got kind of an urban compact form. We also have a nice mix of uses, a lot of people walking around. This did not occur because of transportation planning, though. This was largely a result of the speed of the network. It was as fast as you could walk or ride your horse. So everything had to be close together. But it's a good example of accessibility. Lots of access for these folks because of that close proximity of land use. And that's an important concept in accessibility, that we don't just solve transportation problems by expanding our network. We can solve transportation problems with our land use decisions. So a real important concept that is breaking through at the local city and county level. Now, along with this part of the history show, technology and innovations happened in transportation that really changed the speed of the network. And this had a big influence on both mobility and accessibility. It started with streetcars and rail lines and railroads. We saw our communities stretch out. But when you got to the stations, the nodes, we were still largely limited by the walking speed. But along came the car. This was a big increase in speed of the network. Not by a lot, though, because you can see the condition of the road in this picture. This is early traffic calming. And it resulted in speeds being relatively slow. So we didn't see as dramatic a change as would come just a few years later, a couple decades later, where the speed of the network, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, and our land uses really did spread out. So this took quite a bit of time, over 100 years from start to finish, depending on where you want to draw the lines. And when you think about the transportation planning process, that's just really been active in the last few decades of influencing what we see in terms of our urban form. And I want to give you an example of kind of what that planning process still looks like today in its most simplified form. Here's a quick idea. It's a very linear process. It typically starts with land use planning, whether you're doing a general plan for a city or county, or even doing a small development project. You usually start with the land use concepts before you do anything else. Now, in the land use planning step, that's where the land use planners, they get to go into a room. It's filled with colored pencils, and they create really colorful maps, and they don't let people like me in. Transportation planners, traffic engineers, we're usually not allowed in the room. We have to wait for the plan to emerge. They hand it to us and then ask us, go run your model and tell us what we need to do in terms of recommending a roadway network or a transportation network. And that whole process is largely predicated on usually one mobility metric, level of service, vehicle level service to be specific. Hopefully you guys have heard of level of service. It's a way we measure traffic operations or delay at intersections. It's a report card grade system, A through F. And this very linear process has led to a lot of the plans that resulted in us building the street system that you use today. To give you an example of what this looks like, here's one of those land use plans. Got the pretty colored pencils on here. Residential land uses are separated out from the other non-residential land uses. And this plan is converted into land use amounts or population and employment that we plug into our travel forecasting and traffic operations models and make recommendations about the functional class and the size of the lanes for each roadway in the community. Now, this process has been in place for a number of decades. Again, I mentioned it's linear. It definitely has a number of consequences, and we're going to get into some of those. But a lot of communities would tell you it worked pretty well, at least during the time that the U.S. has been growing. And if you look at this slide, you look at the early 20th century, about 92 million people in the U.S., 500,000 autos, 200,000 miles of paved roads. Look at what happened by the early 21st century. 300 million people, almost as many autos, and 4 million miles of paved roads. So a lot of the planning that's happened during a time with a lot of growth. And so we're trying to keep up with providing infrastructure that was aligned with that growing population and employment. And I said there's a lot of consequences, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them. I'm not going to dwell on this because it's an entirely separate presentation I could give you, and we can get into a little bit more in Q&A. But there are some consequences I want to highlight that are having some of the bigger influences on the shift that we're starting to see between mobility and accessibility. Earliest 20th century, we were seeing about 20% of the urban space consumed for driving and parking. By the early 21st century, that number was getting close to 40% in many of our communities. So what happened during this time? Well, transportation planning happened. We had we had a lot of new regulations. We had things like zoning codes, parking codes, general plans, regional transportation plans, a lot of planning, and a lot of communities basically we're trying to accommodate the auto, making it more comfortable and convenient to use the auto. And this is one of the consequences of that happening. Now, when you think about that, was that a desirable outcome? And a lot of communities are asking themselves that question today because they realize that the quality of their transportation network across all the modes is really important to the quality of life in their community. And quality of life in the community is very important to the ability to attract new businesses, new residents. It's a competitive world, especially after the Great Recession. So this is a very important question in those communities. The other thing that happened during this time that I kind of find fascinating is that when you look at things like zoning codes, during this time, we actually invited the car into the house. We gave it its own room called the garage. A lot of zoning codes actually told us exactly how much space to dedicate to the car. We didn't do it for the people living in the house, but we did it for the vehicle. Did the same thing with parking spaces, lane widths. So obviously, a very strong focus on the vehicle and vehicle mobility. But perspectives are shifting. And here's a good example of that. In the traditional way we measure mobility through level of service, using the level of service A through F rating system, the photo on the left is measured as level of service A. It's measured from a driver's perspective. The one on the right is level of service F. But one of the shifting perspectives is that the cost of building the transportation networks to date it's very expensive to continue operating and maintaining, especially the roadway part of those systems. And so most of the communities I work in right now today, they cannot afford to operate and maintain the networks they've already built. Now that's really important to understand, because the way our mobility-focused planning process works is you tend to only expand the network. You don't take things away. It doesn't get smaller, so it gets bigger over time and more expensive. So one of the new perspectives is looking at the world through the lens of maybe an economist. If the economist were to give those same level service grades out, he'd probably give you an F on the one on the left. That's public infrastructure, and it's not well utilized. That one on the right, that's well utilized. I'd probably give that one an A, again, being the economist. Also thinking about the fact that the way we measure mobility in the context of level service is that we look at the peak 15 minutes of the peak hour of a weekday. All other hours of the day are going to operate much better. And if you think about most cities and counties, when they set their level service thresholds, they don't set it at F. Most of them set it at C or D based on national recommendations. So we're in the peak highest hour utilizing something along the lines of 60, 70, maybe 80% of the actual capacity. We don't do that for sewer lines. We don't do that for water lines. We don't do that for utilities. Very different perspective that has existed in transportation that is now shifting. A couple other things that have happened with this mobility-focused planning is that when you do look at individual roadways or intersections, if you do have a condition where they're not meeting that level service threshold, again, the typical reaction is to expand it. And most of that expansion is focused on making it operate better from the driver's perspective. So in this case, the intersection is being widened so that the drivers will have less delay, will have higher speeds for the drivers to get through the intersection. But one of the things we're doing now is we're thinking more about the other modes. For example, the pedestrians and bicyclists trying to cross this intersection, it's gotten quite a bit bigger. So they're going to be exposed to vehicles for longer periods of time, and those vehicles will be traveling at higher speeds. That creates the potential for much more severe collisions if they do happen. Also, you can see all the extra pavement we're adding in this case. All these darker gray boxes here. That's all additional pavement that's being added. Adds to urban heat island effects, stormwater runoff. In this quadrant down here, we actually had to remove a lot of riparian habitat to accommodate this widening. So sometimes the way we approach transportation planning was pretty myopic. We just looked at whether or not we could improve that vehicle level service, and we ignored a lot of these other impacts or consequences. And it was in large part because of some of the cultural values and choices we were making. Driving around was really important. Now what we're seeing is a number of other objectives being just as important, if not more important. Some of it could be things like greenhouse gas reduction. Some of it could be balancing the needs of other users, bicyclists, pedestrians. And I think it's important to think about the cultural values and choices. This is a picture from Europe a friend of mine took. And she was laughing about one of the planners she met there that was telling her a joke about how in Europe, they basically size their vehicles to fit their communities. And here in the U.S., we size our communities to fit our vehicles. Hence, their vehicles are much smaller than ours. But this is a cultural value or a community value issue. And community values are changing. And so our planning process needs to change along with them. And this is one version of that planning process, how it's evolving. It still starts with the land use process, but the big issue here is an iterative feedback. And in that iterative feedback loop, a couple of things we're taking into direct consideration are those community values. What's important to the community? What are you trying to create? What are you trying to avoid? And what are you trying to protect? And then constraints, like environmental constraints or funding constraints. If we really can't afford to operate and maintain the network we've already built, shouldn't we be doing something differently? And if you're trying to make the most utilization out of the existing network, some of the things we do with land use can have a direct effect on that, obviously. And so the process is starting to evolve. We're trying to size our communities and our transportation networks within these constraints. And this has been what's been happening right up till, I'll say, 2012, 2013. This was kind of happening in the background. But something big happened in 2013 that's kind of accelerating the process. And that was a piece of legislation that was passed, Senate Bill 743. So I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory evolution we've had here in California So you can see what's likely to happen as part of our story here. We're going to see an acceleration of this focus on accessibility. And it all started back with AB 32 in 2006. This is when the state recognized that climate change was real, and the state wanted to take action. You can look at this as crawling out of the primordial ooze. We basically are up on land. We're still down on all fours, and we have a tail, but we're breathing air. Senate Bill 797 came right on its heels. That was a law that basically said we must analyze greenhouse gases in the California Environmental Quality Act. Anytime you're doing a project under CEQA, you have to analyze greenhouse gases. So we got a new metric. Didn't tell us how to do it. Didn't tell us what the thresholds for an impact might be, but we had to analyze it. SB 375 came along as part of AB 32, is where we were going to look at the ability to look at greenhouse gas reduction from land use and transportation decisions. What's interesting to me about this particular step is the state looked at this, in my perspective, in a way and said, wow, that's really tough. Let's hand it off to the regions and let them do it. And so basically MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, were all given the objective to reduce greenhouse gases through the regional transportation planning process. We call that the Sustainable Community Strategies component to an RTP. And along with that, we also had some CEQA relief for load-generating VMT-type projects. So the state is reinforcing their decision here to say, hey, greenhouse gas reduction is really important, and we're trying to set up the right incentives as part of the process. Doubled down on that was Senate Bill 226. That was to give even more CEQA relief to infill projects that were definitely recognized as the lowest generating VMT projects. And then here in 2013, Senate Bill 743 was passed by the governor, and we're still working to get the guidelines to CEQA updated. This particular law is going to be potentially a game changer for us. It's similar to SB 97 in that it gave us a new metric. It basically said, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, you need to develop a new metric for transportation impact analysis. And when you do, level of service as we know it and all similar measures will actually go away. And it'll go away within transit priority areas. Those are areas around high-quality transit stations, for example. And you have the discretion to make it go away statewide. And so far, OPR has indicated they're going to make it go away statewide. And their new metric that they've picked is vehicle miles traveled, VMT. So we have basically a new law that's telling us that the mobility metric we've all been used to is going to go away, and we're going to get a new metric that just so happens to be focused on an accessibility type measure. So regulatory evolution has a lot to do with our story and accelerating the shift. Now, anytime you have regulations change, transportation analysis changes along with it. And some of the change is shown up here. I'm going to show a few more. There's a lot of change. On the right-hand side, a couple documents are really important. The 2010 California Regional Transportation Guidelines. This was updated as a requirement of 375. And a very important chapter here, Chapter 3, on modeling. Gives us all kinds of guidance on how to estimate, calibrate, and validate travel forecasting models, and gives us some guidance on application. And this doesn't just apply to regional plans. This applies to Caltrans. It applies to local agencies. Really raised the bar in California compared to any other state as to the expectations for modeling. And the state backed this up with providing some funding to MPOs and even local jurisdictions for building better models. This is also, when you have guidance like this within the CEQA context we have here in California, this can become a legal benchmark as well. So one of the things I have to do as a consultant, I have to be paranoid half the time. Most of the projects I work on have either been sued or will be sued. So I have to think about stuff like this to make sure that I'm keeping up with the state of the practice and even performing best practices in many cases in a controversial project. The other document here is the first draft of what OPR's come up with for the 743 guidance. What they're actually doing is updating the CEQA guidelines. And they have to identify this new metric, which they've done. They have to provide guidance on thresholds. And they have to do all this in the context of three objectives of 743. That's to reduce greenhouse gases, increase or encourage multimodal networks, and encourage infill development. And when you look at those particular objectives, you can see why vehicle-level service alone doesn't align with them. And you need something like VMT or an accessibility-type metric to do that. On the left-hand side, tons of new technical guidance, tools, data. UC Davis and Susan obviously been in the forefront of this with some of the Senate Bill 735 research. Lots of different tools out there that we've worked on and others, trying to make sure that we make it easier for the local agencies to be able to comply with the new laws. And this is not easy, just because in the case of 743, the law is not fully written yet in terms of what the guidelines are going to include, and we'll get into some of those details here in a minute. So to give you a kind of a broader context of what Senate Bill 743 is really proposing to do, I see it as kind of balancing the playing field between mobility and accessibility. But in addition to balancing the playing field, there's one very important thing it's doing as it relates to how lead agencies will react in their environmental impact analysis. When we're looking at mobility, as I mentioned earlier, when you do have a problem or a deficiency, your response typically is to expand the network, make the intersection bigger, make the road bigger. With accessibility, we don't tend to look at the external network as much as we focus on the project itself. How can I change the project? Not look at the external network. How do I change the project to help it reduce its VMT? Change the mix of uses in the project, increase its density, add a TDM component, transportation demand management. I focus on the project, I don't focus on the external network. Now, in some people's minds, that leaves a hole in the process. Well, what about the external network? Isn't someone paying attention to that? I know the community is concerned about it. People, they're worried about driving around. Well, 743 did not change anything in the way that we approach planning at the city and county level, our general plans. And general plans in cities and counties, they are considered a constitution here in California. It's different than other states. I work in a lot of the other western states. We call them comprehensive plans in the other states, 20-year plans, trying to show you what infrastructure you need to support 20 years of population and employment growth. The plans in other states are like suggestions. In California, they have real teeth. That's my symbol for teeth. In fact, you cannot approve a project in California without making the declaration that it's consistent with your general plan. So we didn't change this, and we didn't change impact fee law here in California. We didn't change the way we handle exactions. So cities and counties can still require mobility-based analysis if they need it on an individual project basis. I think what some of the folks involved in 743 had hoped is that one of the big fundamental changes we'd see in California is that we'd rely more heavily on the general plans in developing a vision for our each community and making sure that we're putting in place the appropriate financing mechanisms to fully fund the infrastructure concepts. That's been one of the biggest disconnects in California. I think I can name one jurisdiction in California that fully funds its long-range vision for its circulation element as part of the general plan. It's El Dorado County. Now, they have an impact fee that's as high as $45,000 for a single-family unit, but they fully fund their circulation element. Almost every other city and county in California doesn't fully fund its circulation element. And what they do is they rely on the CEQA process and this ad hoc basis for each individual project to come along and identify its fair share portion of the mitigation to build little pieces of the network as they go. So the idea here is let's go back to the general plan process here and make sure that we've identified the correct vision for the community, and let's make sure we put in place the ability to fund that. And that's where this new planning process works in looking at those financial constraints up front. So got an idea here of what 743 is doing and not doing. Because it has selected VMT as the preferred metric, One that's the air pollution version that's based on boundaries. One of them is where I try to do a full accounting. Greenhouse gases, we need to know where all of that will occur. Doing a good job possible accounting for it. So here's just one of the issues we run into with these two, is figuring out what the right methodology is. And we'll probably see some guidance out of OCR, but it's definitely an area that we're going to have questions about. The next area that we're going to have questions about has to do with thresholds. And Kevin's already taken this question on, and so She the only one? I didn't say UC Davis. I said Davis. Okay. If we take the SACOG data, yes, it is. But there's one part of the SACOG data that influences that quite a bit, and that's the fact that the boundary of the model ends right there at Solano County. If we were to count for the full length of trips that go in and out of Davis, Davis residents tend to be high income. They have relatively high number of vehicles per household. We've also done specific studies of the actual trip generation rates in Davis. Now, this is a community that has a very high bike and walk mode split for getting to campus, getting to jobs even. Yet, despite that, the single-family vehicle trip rate in Davis is actually higher than the national average reported by ITE for single-family units. In fact, the local model that we helped develop for the city and the campus, that's built into it, that Davis as a community actually generates higher vehicle trips. Again, the incomes have something to do with that. The fact that we pack quite a few students into some of those houses probably has something to do with that. The household size is a little bit larger than normal. So those are some factors you have to take into account. And if you're going to measure this on something like a per household basis versus a per capita basis, you're going to get different types of results. These are all the kinds of things we have to think about before we write them down into the law and force everybody to use them statewide. Another threshold that OPR has looked at is just this idea of you put the development project in the right location. You put it in one of these transit priority areas, near a high-quality transit corridor. These are typically transit corridors that have peak 15-minute headways in both the morning and evening. Now, this by itself may seem like a good idea. We're putting the development in the right location. But what if the development comes in is not dense enough? That's a really important question because one of the steps in our planning process is to think about how projects are consistent with our regional plans. I mentioned earlier that the MPOs have these sustainable community strategies, SESs. And the idea is that local development projects would come in consistent with that SES so that they don't jeopardize the greenhouse gas reduction plan or the air quality conformity that typically occurs with those plans. That's where we basically meet the federal requirements for air pollution reduction. So by just giving a pass to projects that locate in the right place without thinking about their consistency to the SES could be problematic. And so one of the other thresholds they have, which right now only applies to land use plans, is this idea of being SES consistent. I would suggest that at a minimum we need all projects to demonstrate their SES consistent as a first step. Another aspect of that, though, is not all the MPOs have made it really easy to do an SES consistency check. We happen to be in the SACOG region. They have, so they do have a model that we could all follow. One of the other thresholds I want to mention quickly here is that this is not just about development projects. If you're looking through the accessibility lens, you're also looking at infrastructure projects. And then in the CEQA context, we look at all discretionary projects. So in the initial OPR guidance, they've actually decided what's acceptable versus not acceptable VMT based on the type of new roadway lane you want to build. They basically already acknowledged that transit projects, ped, bike projects, you get a pass. The green areas up here, HOV lanes, managed lanes, you get a pass. Auxiliary lanes, those little lanes between on and off ramps, you get a pass. General purpose lanes on freeways or arterials in congested areas, you don't get a pass. In fact, you're likely to be a significant impact out of the box under the idea that you'd be inducing more vehicle travel by putting in those types of lanes in those types of areas where existing congestion already occurs. And so in the context of moving away from a mobility focus to an accessibility focus, we have a lot of questions. We got the metric, and I think the metric's probably the right one. Methodology, a full accounting of VMT is probably a good idea, but how you do that, is it across land use types? Is it across your network? Is it just a citywide average, a region-wide average? Lots of those questions still exist. Now, if time allows as part of the presentation, I'll give you an example. Okay, Susan? I'll give you an example of a VMT threshold that's already in effect. It's right here in Yolo County. As part of the Yolo County General Plan a few years ago, we were working on it at the time that basically the Attorney General's office here at the state was threatening to sue or actually legally challenging general plans up and down the state that were not addressing climate change. So unique time, and so a little bit of pressure to look at the world a little differently. And so one of the things that we talked about as part of that plan and the alternatives development is how can we create alternatives to accommodate the Yolo County population and employment growth that would be sensitive to climate change. So the alternatives were the first part. They started with doing things like, well, let's pack all the growth around Davis. Davis didn't like that idea. Made a lot of sense from a VMT perspective, though, because this is a relatively low-generating VMT community, and if there's more demand for growth in Yolo County, put it around an existing city, Davis or Woodland. Neither city tended to like that alternative, and so the county was forced to look to other areas. And they, in fact, looked at places like Dunnigan, way up here. They looked at the Capay Valley to accommodate some of their growth. So if they're going to allow the growth to happen out in a greenfield location, instead of putting it around an existing community, is there some way they could design it to make it low VMT generating? And so what we started with was trying to understand VMT patterns by different types of communities. With the unincorporated Yolo County being an 83, versus even low-density San Ramon with high incomes being a 76, working our way down, 52 for the SACOG region back in 2005. Yolo County at 49 county-wide because of places like Davis and Woodland. And then looking at other places, Transit Village in Rockridge there, Urban Center North Beach, San Francisco, and Metro Center in Manhattan. You can kind of see how urban form affects the need to travel by vehicle. So what did we do? Well, we kind of looked around and said, well, what's achievable in Yolo County? And so we tried to isolate Winters, Woodland, Davis, West Sacramento, and compared it to the existing unincorporated areas, which were all quite a bit higher. So we knew, well, there's something to the fact that the Davises and the Woodlands of the area that are relatively compact communities. They have hard edges. They're big enough, though, that they have a full range of services. And so we did a little additional research to try and figure out what do you have to do to achieve a full range of services? You know, how many people do you need to have enough community commercial, to have a elementary, junior high, and high school, and to have a medical facility? And what we came up with was, well, you need to be around 25,000 people. And there was at least that amount of growth demand in Yolo County. And so in the Dunnigan specific plan area, the general plan actually specified that what needed to happen was to make the new growth areas perform as well as if we put the development next to Woodland and Davis. Seems like a great concept, right? Okay, we're just going to make this new area perform as well as these existing areas. And from a greenhouse gas or a VMT standpoint, the math works. We're done, right? Great. Sounds like a perfect solution. At least it seemed like that at the time. I'm now the consultant having to prepare the transportation analysis for that specific plan, and the reality is a little different. So realize this all happened before we had a law that said that VMT should be the desired metric and any guidance on thresholds. So we were making some educated guesses as to what the best line to draw, literally, about what was acceptable versus unacceptable. And so in actually doing the specific plan, the VMT threshold has had a few very positive effects. One, it forced us to come up with a concept that has a very small urban footprint, only about 1.5 miles by about 1.5 miles, very small. Average density is over 8 dwelling units per acre. We did not use level service at all to design the roads. It's all a 2-lane road system with a separate green network for bikes, peds, and NEVs, neighborhood electric vehicles. And so in that context, if you lived in the community, you literally wouldn't need to drive around. The problem is if you ever need to leave the community, it's at least 16 miles to Woodland. So we got 32 miles round trip, assuming that you just made one stop in Woodland, that's it, and you weren't going any farther. Our modeling showed people would probably go a little further. Davis is a pretty popular destination, as well as Sacramento, north of Thomas. So our initial results out of the model with the best possible urban design we could come up with was probably around 53 to 55 VMT per weekday. This particular threshold, by the way, is measured on a household basis. It's VMT generated per household per weekday. And so we're still working on that. What we do know is to get to all the way to 44 would require what I call program elements, TDM programs, or really creative things, something like the University of California does with workforce housing programs, where you basically would be subsidize your mortgage for owning or living in an apartment, even subsidize rents if you have a job in the specific planned area. So we get a guaranteed match between the home and the job. Or a Google Bus concept, where basically the community is going to have to pay for a Google Bus, either to take their residents to specific jobs. The casino is one. UC Davis is another. The airport is another. So you start having to think very differently about the project. Realize we're not thinking about the external network. We're not thinking about widening I-5 or doing any of that kind of analysis. We're largely thinking about how do we really minimize the need to travel by vehicle without getting too draconian or pushing the market envelope beyond what the project can afford. And that's where we're really running into this difficulty. And we have a question, which is perfect because that's the end of the presentation.
Okay, let's open it up.
Yes. Yeah, so the question was, to what extent could just normal fixed route bus transit service helps? Yeah, obviously expanded from what's out there today. I think it's one trip every Tuesday and Thursday or something like that, if I remember right. It's not even every day.
Where?
To Dunnigan. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so what would happen if we just increased the fixed route bus service to make it much more frequent? And that is something that has been evaluated as part of the plan. Again, it runs up against the financial feasibility. We projected that to really get a lot of people to use it, we'd need something closer to 15-minute headways, especially during the peak periods, and then nothing less than like 30 minutes to an hour during the off-peak. To service that, we actually worked with the Yolo County Transit District. They did the math for us and came back with, yeah, we could do this. Here's all we need. When you add up the cost of the buses and then the annual operating cost, the numbers were in the millions. If I remember right, a kind of full build-out of the project would be close to $12 million a year, much more than what they currently spend to serve any other similar-sized area. Yeah, counting what they would get back in the fare box recovery. And that's one of the challenges. It's also one of the things we actually compared was using, well, how can we reduce that cost? Using a public operator versus a private operator. We thought we'd be saving a lot of money if we went to a private operator, because oftentimes you will save money using a private operator. But Yolo County's Transit District, they operate very effectively, very efficiently, and so there wasn't a lot of cost savings to be gained there. So we tried that, but ran up against the literally financial feasibility of it. Question over here?
I'm curious about sort of two-part question. The legacy issues of these specific plans and transit-oriented developments that just predate this, and sort of the reconciling of that with the SCSs, and sort of, I know that that's like, especially like South Bay, you have these specific plans that started in the 80s and 70s even, and they're still being built out. And now you're trying to figure out how to fit in with those goals.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
I think I'll summarize this as the basic question being that how do you address the legacy projects that already have their entitlements that may not fit within the current community values or the environmental constraints? And you could say the same thing for transportation projects. There are a number of larger transportation projects in regional transportation plans that are actually contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution emissions, and may not be consistent, but it takes so long for those projects to get through the STIP process, it's hard to take them out of the plan. I think that is definitely going to be a challenging area, especially in the context of CEQA, because every new discretionary action by a lead agency, this goes to your specific plans in particular, if a development project comes in, even if it's consistent with the specific plan but requires a new approval, a new discretionary approval by let's say the city council, that's subject to CEQA. And so these new rules would apply, and you would have to go through this new impact analysis. I think where you run into the real challenge is then in the mitigation. There's a number of tests for mitigation feasibility. And in some cases, this new development project may be forced to mitigate. In other cases, maybe they have things like a development agreement with the city that would preclude them having to actually do the mitigation. And you would override the impact on that basis, that there's already a contract in place that limits what the city can require. So those are all going to be case by case, but you could end up seeing some retrofitting maybe of those previous entitlement decisions. And I think that's one of the things that accessibility starts to point towards. If we only look at vehicle mobility, we only look at this ability to expand the network. When you look at accessibility, retrofitting the land use is a fundamental part of solving an accessibility problem.
Do you think there actually will be some
There could be. I think some of it already is happening because of market conditions. What they got approved for is not what they want to build now because the market's changed. So there's that opportunity as well. Let's see, next question. I'll take one up here and then we'll go to the back. Okay, two separate questions coming. Yeah, so let's take the first part of the question here. This is about, in the Dunnigan case, the project will develop more over time. And so the first people to move in will likely be, in the typical specific plan fashion, you build the homes first. They'll have much higher levels of VMT than people move in year 20, when it's a more full-service community. That's actually one of the points of debate with the developer and the county, because the way that the general plan is being interpreted by the county is they have to meet the VMT threshold on a phased approach. So they have right now like 4 phases, and you consider them maybe like 5-year increments. Trying to meet the 44 threshold in the first phase is going to be very difficult because they won't have the retail, they won't have the supporting services. Everyone would have to ride a bus. So that's definitely a challenge, and you're exactly right. You're going to have to figure out a way to accept a higher level of VMT if you're going to approve the project. The other thing that the general plan requires is ongoing monitoring. So one of the things the specific plan has to do is not only in the planning process measure it by phase. They literally, I think it's every 2 years, actually would have to do something equivalent to a household survey to figure out what the actual VMT is. And the idea was there's only so much control you have over the developer during the actual construction of the project. Then there's what do you do next? And so the idea was to set up a community-based fund potentially that would allow them to actually have money to pay for things like TDM programs that the community would have to pay for to keep themselves low VMT generating over time. Something that's never been done before. So that's the kinds of things we're having to deal with in trying to implement this new metric and threshold. And yet,
Follow on to that.
Yeah.
What kind of cost increase?
Well, okay, so that's a great question, is, the cost side and what to assume about how the county's approaching this. So one thing the county's not doing, and they've been very open about, is that they've said to the developer, this will not be a market-based project, meaning that you're going to have to do things outside the normal market. You can't use the market won't bear this as a rational reason to not do it. They're expecting to have a very creative, innovative developer. And yeah, it may mean, therefore, that the cost of the development is higher. Now, one of the debates about this is when you look at the cost of development and what it buys you. A lot of the communities that are high cost in terms of their infrastructure, their services, also provide the highest quality of life and the most desirable places to be. And so that's one of the things I think the city's looking at. The current development team is, on the other hand, saying, but we've always built homes within market forces and those kinds of things. So you have a clash. You have a real clash. A developer that's probably used to a very linear process by which you analyze your impacts and you mitigate them to the extent feasible. And if it's not financially feasible, you just don't do it. And Yolo County is saying, no, we're going to hold you to a little higher bar. We expect this to be different. And part of the reason that they wanted this to be different is all the pressure they got from the AG's office to say, you need to do something really different to guarantee that this greenfield site, 16 miles from Woodland, is really going to perform as well as putting that development right next to the city of Davis or Woodland. Okay, second part of the question. Yeah. So this is one of the more fascinating aspects of looking at the world through an accessibility lens. So if I was to do the normal type environmental impact analysis and just look at mobility, you don't quite see that picture emerge because you just look at the impacts of your project on the immediate network around it. But one of the things that starts to emerge when you look at accessibility is you take a place like Davis, and Davis obviously has a limited housing supply and has a lot of regulatory limits, including a public vote on whether or not they're going to expand residential development here. So from a regional perspective, you would want to put more development in Davis because of the infrastructure, the urban design here. It's a low VMT area. By not doing that, you're creating a VMT impact on the rest of the region. And what you're going to start to see, this is my prediction anyway, is when you start to look through an accessibility lens and you look at a Davis or other similar communities that take that kind of perspective, or like we have a few people from South Bay, like Kevin, look at Silicon Valley. When you start looking at projects through an accessibility lens and you're increasing the land use imbalance by trying to either add employment in a place like Davis or San Jose, from a VMT perspective and a regional perspective, when you're doing a full accounting of that, it makes VMT higher. It makes air pollution worse. It makes greenhouse gases worse. We really haven't told that story very accurately in the past. 743 and the way it's going, that's the exact story we'll be telling from a transportation perspective. And so your impact is very different than just looking at the local network around you and whether or not the intersections need to be bigger. So great question. So we'll take one in the back now because we don't have one all the way in the back. Yeah, so the question is really about the household survey data that we're using here in California and its availability outside California and specifically with trying to capture the full length of the trip, especially those longer distance trips. So outside California, we at least have the National Household Travel Survey. And this is something that we at Fair and Peers have just got done doing a lot of analysis with. We have this new tool. It's called Main Street. It's built off the work we did with US EPA a few years ago to build a better mixed-use trip generation tool. If you look at the standard IT trip generation, it's one variable, the amount of the land use type. We have 7 variables. So we're trying to capture that built environment influence. But we also, knowing we're going to apply this thing in California, we want to build the ability to calculate VMT by land use type. One of the challenges with the current guidance. And so what we did is we looked for all the different sources for trip length information. And what we found was, the typical household surveys, and they're okay at an aggregate level. They don't really work very well when you try and boil down to an individual city or county. NHTS is even a smaller sample size, so not real great for that. So then we started looking at the streetlight data and the AirSage data. In fact, we've worked with AirSage on a very specific data product they offer, which is called long-distance trips, where they filter out all the short-distance trips, and you only look at the long-distance trips. And we're actually using it to help us calibrate the models we built in the San Joaquin Valley. We have 8 MPOs there, and we have 6 different models. And one of the big questions is those longer distance commute patterns between counties. And so working with AirSage and their cell phone data, that's going to be the basis for those particular calibration adjustments to the trip lengths. Yeah, so AirSage data they're out of Atlanta, Georgia. They're a national provider. And their sample can vary based on where it's at in the country because they have just certain contracts with certain cell phone providers. But they'll tell you exactly what their market penetration is of the cell phone providers they're using, and you'll have a pretty good idea. It's always robust. Let's just put it that way. We haven't had a problem with the sample sizes in any of the markets that we've had to use it. Another question? Here in the middle, pink. Yeah, so the question is about the dual network we propose in the Dunnigan specific plan, where we have basically 2 networks, one completely dedicated to PED, bike, and NEVs, and then one which is just a 2-lane road system. And it's basically a grid, very similar to Davis. And the question was whether or not, why don't we just look at low speeds on the regular network and allow all the modes to use it? We actually do. So the regular network is very low speed, and all the modes are also allowed on it. But if you want a completely protected path between any origin destination, you actually can do that on a completely protected system. So it's actually kind of think of it as what we do for cars, where we have freeways completely grade separated and no stopping supposedly, and local arterials and collectors. We're doing the same thing. If you want to be out there in mixed flow traffic as a bicyclist, you can. But if you want a completely protected experience where you're only surrounded by other low-speed modes, you can do that as well. Per household. I think if we actually measured on a per-person basis, it wouldn't be out of line. I think the actual numbers were national IT average 9.54, 9.57, somewhere in that range. We were measuring the single-family households close to 11.5 here in the city of Davis. Vehicle trips. But on a multifamily, basis, it was very similar. And if you think of the difference between single-family and multifamily, it's very difficult in most of the rental units to squeeze in any extra bodies, whereas in the single-family households, it's much easier to do that. And so when you look at the average household sizes, I think that's a contributing factor as well. We were just looking, isolating individual neighborhoods and measuring the cars going in and out just to come up with a trip rate. Yeah, and this is also important. Anytime we're making changes in practice, which changing to VMT is a big deal. It's putting a spotlight on trip generation as well as the trip lengths. And on trip generation in particular, one of the challenges we've had with introducing this new US EPA MXD model into practice is most cities and counties are reluctant to change. And so they want to basically use the IT rates as the default industry standard. From my perspective, there are trip rates of last resort, because what IT will tell you in their handbook is that you should be using locally valid rates. Go do at least data collection at 3 similar locations, in fact, to estimate your trip rate for your type of project in the community you're going to try and build it. And this notion that traffic engineers or transportation planners have that these are somehow default rates is just so disconnected from being accurate, especially in a place like California. We tend to be a little car-centric. We have higher incomes. And so that's a real disconnect for me as a practicing planner that is going to be doing a CEQA document that might get sued. I want to make sure I've got accurate answers. Yeah.
Lot of basic research and found out that land use projects in infill areas tend to produce up to 50% less, fewer vehicle trips based on whatever the metric is per square foot or per household number of housing units compared to the IT trip generation rates. And so, IT has been very kind of quiet about this. I posted the announcement myself on LinkedIn, but I have a feeling that most transportation engineers, including those who really need this information, like the cities and counties that are reviewing development projects, don't know about this. So, if they're using the old rates.
Yeah, so it was kind of a question statement.
Well, I have a question too.
Yeah.
I have a question I want to ask.
So just in case it didn't get picked up in the mic, so Terry Parker, who when she was at Caltrans did a lot of the cool research on trip generation and other things, working with Susan and her group. There is a lot of new information out there. The NCHRP 684 project does include a lot of information about, and in fact is evolving to this new IT recommended practice that we're all kind of waiting for. Well, it's out, but we're waiting for it to be kind of accepted, I guess, in practice. And in fact, one of the things that we did with at Fair and Pierce is we actually took that methodology and combined it with the US EPA methodology to see if it created a better outcome. And the answer is yes, it did. It was really cool. So, but the challenge for us is how do we get anything new into practice, especially when you deal with larger bureaucracies where they tend to write down their guidance and then it sticks there for a few years, and it's hard to get it unstuck and to change it. Some of the more, I don't want to call them progressive agencies necessarily, but the ones that are more willing to embrace the innovation stuff, Pasadena in Southern California, or a Davis or up in Northern California, we're making plenty of strides in. But there's so many other places where it's a challenge to get the change occurring. And I'm hopeful with the spotlight being put on VMT with 743, everyone will be now looking at what's out there in terms of data, not just the IT trip generation information or the research happening with trip lengths and cell phone data, but putting all that together. And that's really what's missing. And this is a really big change if you think about us, practitioners. We've been used to looking at this external network and doing level service calculations for decades. And in the span of basically a couple of years, we're expected to just kind of ignore that and turn over here and do this brand new thing. And a lot of consultants, that do basically traffic studies, they don't do forecasting and modeling that gets you to VMT. They do intersection operations and trip generation for local development projects. So this is a really big change. And so to the extent that, some of the questions I've posed here today and some of the other ones that are out there in the comment letters on OPR's website, those are the things that we need more help addressing, especially in the short amount of time that OPR has to actually write guidance.
Well, that leads to my question, and that is,
So the question is really about how is OPR looking at the various tools that exist, old ones, new ones, as it relates to the ability to accurately forecast VMT. In their guidance, they did look at a very long list of potential tools, and they put up quick little summaries of them. And I think it's Appendix F, if I remember right, on their website. And you can see all these different tools, and they didn't really come out and do an extensive evaluation, though, which one's good, which ones have limitations. They're really pointing to their more formal guidance that suggests whatever you do in calculating VMT should be a full accounting of the VMT to the extent possible. And so depending on what tool you use, if it doesn't quite do a full accounting, you at least want to acknowledge that limitation. That's typical SQL practice. And if you can, compensate for it if you know what it is. Yes.
So we're about to run out of time. I'm going to take the last question.
That's prerogative.
Sort of following up on it's really hard to change practice. But here in California, we've now got the state policy. What do you see as the outlook for changing California spilling over around the rest of the country?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of, is California unique and going to be sitting all by itself doing this, or is anybody else going to follow? So we have offices in the western states and opening one in D.C., and I've been asking this question, and I was really surprised by what happened last year at the Institute of Transportation Engineers District 6 conference. It was in, I think, North Dakota, of all places, a little removed from California. But one of the topics they wanted to talk about was Senate Bill 743 and what was happening in California. I think there was a combination of fear that it would escape California and come to other states. There was also a desire to learn more about it, and there were some places that were actively interested in seeing a different way of evaluating their community. Where it seemed to has resonated the most is in what I'll call mature communities. There's plenty of communities that they're pretty mature. They're still doing infill, and there's still some growth, but they're really not expanding their networks. And they want to know, how do we best assess, where we should be putting this development, allowing it? How do we assess the impacts? And so there's one aspect of it is accessibility. Another aspect of it is more managing their network operations. And so I think in those kinds of communities, they're definitely interested and open to this. And at TRB this year, looking around, there was a few sessions on it. Kevin's was one. There were others that talked about it. And in talking with direct clients in the district and in Maryland and Arlington, I was at Transportation Camp the day before, which if you haven't been, go. Transportation Camp is absolutely fantastic. A lot of interest in exactly what we were doing. And the fact that it led to conclusions or outcomes that cut across not just vehicle mobility, but cut across all the modes, cut across public health, cut across land use consumption, and other environmental impacts. So I do see this as a trend that will go outside California. Whether it's escaping or people are grabbing onto it and dragging it out, maybe that's a question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Everyone hold still for a sec. I have to take a
Group shots.
Group
Wow.
shot.
First time that's happened. Yeah, we know. That's great.
Besides your audience. That was really wonderful. I loved the history part. That was so helpful. Yeah. Every talk on yeah. Where are we?
I needed some help figuring out how to set the read up.
That was a good question.
We should pay the bills.
Like when we voted down. Whatever that project was.
Someone need to.
Oh.
Not to pretend
not being selfish.
I was playing yesterday. Like, did I get to read on my napkin? I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong.